Hello, friends. You're listening to the Theology Mill from Whitford Publishers. I'm your host, Zach Mickle. I appreciate you tuning in today from wherever you may be. So, on this episode, you're going to hear my conversation with James Greenaway about his 2023 book, A Philosophy of Belonging: Persons, Politics, Cosmos. And real quick, a big shout out and a thank you to the fine people at Notre Dame Press for providing a complimentary copy of the book for this interview. And if you'd like to keep up with the latest from the Theology Mill, you can follow us on YouTube or Spotify or wherever else you may be streaming this episode. Or even better, you can subscribe to our newsletter for semi-monthly news and book deals. If you'd like to do that, you can see the links in the description below for all the information. So now let's jump to my discussion with James Greenaway. Thanks as always for listening, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. I'm joined today by James Greenaway, who is the author of a book called A Philosophy of Belonging: Persons, Politics, and Cosmos with Notre Dame Press. So, James, thank you so much for joining the Theology Mill today. As we're kicking things off here to start, could you maybe just share a bit with our listeners about yourself and your work?
Sure, Zach. Yeah. And thanks very much for the invitation. I've enjoyed listening to other interviews that you've done with people on this podcast. So, it's a privilege. Anyway, yeah. I'm a philosopher. I'm from Northern Ireland. I don't know what people know about Northern Ireland, but it hasn't always been the most peaceful of places, I would say. And in the midst of our not quite civil war, but very close to it. I was growing up, and I think that I would say that I became a philosopher probably because of those early experiences, like becoming aware of a lot of disorder around, a lot of political disorder, civil disorder. It seemed very, very close, and I didn't know it then, but I was probably starting to think about political things in a philosophical way. But that's who I am. My father was sort of a Protestant and belonged to one political tradition, and my mother, Catholic, belonged to another tradition. And under normal circumstances, those two types of people don't ever get together. And I mean, obviously, I owe my very existence to their willingness to overcome a lot of the social restrictions. So I'm the sort of person who feels very connected to both sides of the divide in Northern Ireland. When things were pretty bad, we moved across the border to Dublin, and I finished my education there. I went to the University College Dublin, did my PhD in philosophy, and in 2011, I moved with my family, my wife and my kids, from Ireland to San Antonio to work for St. Mary's University. So, like my interests are, broadly speaking, political philosophy. And I wrote my PhD dissertation in medieval political philosophy. And a lot of people sort of scratch their heads and go, like, was there such a thing? And I suppose my task was to try and lay out, yes, a lot of work was being done in the medieval period in terms of political order. But, in general, I'm interested in what you might call a philosophy of the person. And it's led me into all kinds of areas. Like I'm interested in consciousness, embodiment. I'm interested, obviously, in the political and the legal. And I teach philosophy of religion, medieval philosophy, political philosophy, philosophy of law. And maybe one more thing to say is that I have this role at the moment where I bring faculty and staff in the university together to read and discuss texts that come out of the classical Christian tradition And, for the sake of, small groups of us meeting and thinking together about important things, our lives and our roles as professors and professionals and persons, and to try to get to the sense of the university less as sort of an institution and more as a community. It's
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose you might call it trying to build up something called political, or well, let's say philosophical friendship, which is sort of the asking of questions together. And I suppose that's a nice model for what lies at the heart of a university. Like, we're all asking questions together, whatever but the answers. It's the questions that we ask together. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So you've probably experienced a pretty significant transition in weather moving from North Ireland to San Antonio, I
It,
imagine.
it took about 2 years for the damp and the cold to, get out of my bones. So,
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, you had to sweat it all out.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Okay, well, let's move to our theology meal opener, which I ask all of our guests. So, if you could have dinner with any one thinker, they can be dead or alive, a philosopher, a theologian, or any person you might like, who would you choose? And what's one burning question that you would most want to ask that person?
Yeah. So I actually didn't have to think too long about this one. There's somebody that I would love to have met, and I don't even know if she actually really existed. But she has a kind of a presence. Her name is Diotima, and you find her in Plato's Symposium in the sixth speech. And Diotima seems to be the person or the mentor who taught Socrates. Like, can you imagine meeting the teacher of Socrates? So, I'm not even sure what I would ask her. I mean, that's your question. My question would be, who are you?
Mhm,
Um, like, if you don't mind, like, I'll sort of say something about like that sixth speech in the symposium, because
mhm,
it's Socrates who's speaking, and he credits everything he says to Diotima, and this is just stunning to me. That the symposium itself, as many of your listeners would know, is this series of speeches in praise of eros, or love. And the first five speeches are all about how love is a great god. And then Socrates stumbles in, and he's like, "What's everybody talking about?" And the answer is, "Well, we're praising love." And he says, "Ah, love, right? Yeah." He says, "Now there's something I do know something about." And there's a sort of an irony there, because the previous irony is that, of course, Socrates famously states that all he knows is that he knows nothing.
mhm,
Okay. And
mhm,
well, here's something he claims to know something about, but it's not because of him, it's because of Diotima. And, basically what she's doing is she's setting out that love is this sort of in between reality. The phrase in Greek is metaxou, that love is an in between reality, that it's not that love is this God, a God that love is divine, but nor is it human or mortal. It's something in between. And so that when we pray, it's love that carries our prayers to the gods, and their response, their favor, the flow of grace comes back via love. That love exists in between. And she tells this story about, like, she personifies Eros. Okay, so this mythical character Eros. This is the story that she tells Socrates. Um, and it just blows me away every time I read it and I talk to my students about it. That on the birthday of Aphrodite, who's associated with beauty, um, there is plenty, right? And plenty is this god who's personified, and he's at this feast, and of course he has too much. He drinks too much nectar, and he gets drunk, and he's kind of stumbles out for some air or whatever, and uh, and then this other character called Poverty spots plenty. Now, of course, Poverty, also being divine, is around Mount Olympus or whatever, but being Poverty, she's not invited to the feast, and she spots plenty coming out, And she sort of thinks, well, maybe I could sort of do better for myself if I were to lie down with plenty. And so she lies with plenty in his drunken state, and poverty and plenty, they what issues from them is eros. And
Mm.
eros is a bit like his father, in that, he's like, when one loves or one is in love, you sort of feel lifted up, you feel full, you feel complete. You're full of ideas and imagination and energy, and you direct everything towards the beloved. Um, but at the same time, like, love is what sets you up for heartache. And inevitably, you know, like, people pass, and I suppose the cost of love is always going to be the sense of loss, and you feel that poverty. So love for Diotima flows in and out and in and out. And while the beloved is always beautiful, because love gives you the eyes to see the beauty of the beloved. Like, those who don't love your beloved don't necessarily see the beauty of your
Mm-hmm.
beloved, but you do, because you love. Um, but you know, we're mortal. So, but love seems to be the immortal principle in the mortal creature.
Mm.
So, when you love, you become more than simply mortal. You don't become immortal, but you exist in this sort of in between spirit, and it's love that does that for you. So, like, to try and think that through and think about, okay, concretely, like, how does this mad story about poverty and plenty, how does that fit into my life? I mean, that's just that's that's just an endless train of thought for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I
Mm-hmm.
would like to speak to Diotima. I say, who are you, Diotima? I could also ask her a gossipy kind of question. What was young Socrates like? That'd be interesting too. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway, that maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, thank you. That might have been the most well thought out response to that question that I've heard so far. So thank you for that. And I want to turn to your book, but I'm imagining that love will come up again in the conversation, so it won't be the end of that. But I wanna ask, just first, what was kind of the genesis of this book on belonging? Like, what led you to write a book specifically about belonging?
Zach, this is a short answer. I was homesick.
Mm.
I was just homesick. You know, um, I suppose it took a few years for me to get adjusted. And by the way, you know, I was 39 when I emigrated, um, and I would say that emigration is a young person's game.
Mm.
It's really hard to do, and especially when you've got a family with you. So it took a few years for us to adjust and sort of get our feet on the ground, I suppose. I think that we just felt like we were surviving. We're just sort of barely functioning. And there were a few years like that. And then when things sort of settled down, I kind of turned around and I started to feel a sort of a sadness. I was like, it's such a blessing to be somewhere like Texas. But until you get used to it, you sort of feel what's no longer there, and what means so much to you. Like, I missed my family, obviously, and my all my friends. Um, I also missed things like sort of the plants and the animals of Ireland, and the seasons, and the wind that never stops blowing. I even started to miss the rain. It's just all the elements of place. They became conspicuous through their absence. And so, and I started to feel kind of sad for my kids as well, that they'd be growing up without, like, things like the Irish language, Irish humor, Irish music. I could do my best to, substitute for some of that they wouldn't be getting, but inevitably it's not going to be the same. So,
Mhm.
so I'd say a lot of those early years, once we got our feet on the ground, for me anyway, they were dominated by sadness. And I looked around and I thought, well, I'm meant to be a philosopher here. I shouldn't be just wallowing in this. This is ridiculous. So what do the philosophers say? And I didn't find a whole lot. So I felt like I was tasked with thinking my way through this.
Mm-hmm.
And, I suppose that's what philosophers are meant to do.
Mm-hmm.
So homesickness and the sense of belonging that wasn't
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
became my focus.
Yeah, I know that's a big thing you bring up in the book is how the theme of belonging has, in some ways, kind of been overlooked by kind of the field of philosophy, by philosophers. So I'm wondering if you might say something about kind of why you think there's this sort of relative muteness, or just this kind of quiet on the topic of belonging
Yeah,
specifically
yeah.
among philosophers throughout history.
Yeah, muteness is a good term, Zach. Uh, so, like on the one hand, you've got a lot of I make note of this in the book. Like people who are in the social sciences, they've been working with belonging for decades.
Mm-hmm.
We've got all kinds of measurements and statistics, and it's like it's it it's a big theme in the social sciences. Um, um, but when you move into philosophy, it's like, who are the philosophers of belonging? Um, I had a hard time finding. There are some, and I make note of that in my first chapter, and we kind of explore a little bit of that. But generally speaking, it seems as though philosophers are not really interested in belonging, but something that you might call its opposite, which is maybe alienation.
Mm.
Um, like famously, there's the Entfremdung by Hegel. Heidegger talks about alienation and thrownness. There's Jean-Paul Sartre. You've got the critical theorists like Horkheimer and Adorno. There are lots of people who write about alienation. So the muteness, though, like just to come back to that, like the book that I wrote was, it has to be seen as something of a moving viewpoint. And where I make these claims at the beginning of the book, I modify them as we go along. And it's not that I change my mind necessarily. It's that the context has deepened, or at least broadened as the book goes on. And what looks like muteness or indifference towards belonging, um, I I think is later disclosed as like a genuine concern for belonging, because after all, like the condition for feeling alienated is that there's a belonging that's missing. Like you don't have an experience of alienation unless it's an experience of not belonging. So what is the experience of belonging that's missing? And so on the surface, it looks like philosophers are not interested in belonging because they write about alienation. But you start to dig a little bit more deeply, and you find that actually this is a concern for belonging after all. I
Mm-hmm.
suppose
Mm-hmm.
I made my peace with my fellow philosophers that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to touch on the sort of some of the political dimensions of the book. You get into this later in the book, but even early on in the book, you kind of warn. I'm gonna quote a little bit, just a short little bit from you that you say we need to be careful since the concern with belonging has been co-opted by various partisans across the political spectrums at different times. So could you say more about this kind of co-opting by partisans? How has belonging been kind of politically co-opted, and why is a topic like belonging seen by a lot of academics with quite a bit of suspicion?
Well, there's only so much I can really say about this. But like what I'm doing is I'm trying to make the case for the worthiness of belonging as a topic that we should concern ourselves with. But a lot of times when you try to read whatever literature is there, you find that um, it tends to be presented in terms of us groups, like groups like us versus them, in groups and
Mhm,
out groups.
mhm,
And that belonging, therefore, is something which you should be suspicious of, because if you include some, you've got to exclude others. And, like that's fair enough. But is that like the final thing to say about belonging? And I think not. I mean, the comment is not aimed at the sort of left, right, normal, tension that you find in political societies. The sorts of tensions that play themselves out with, concerns for rights and concerns for responsibilities. Where there's an emphasis on individual persons, and others put an emphasis on sort of the common good, let's say. Like this, the usual pushing back and forth that results in compromises, partial successes. That's just the normal business of politics. So so when I talk about partisans, I'm not really talking about kind of the regular people who do the business of politics. Um, the business of politics is predicated upon those of us who basically share some goods in common, right? For example, like liberty, equality. These are like, political goods that we all respect, that we all find are important. These are things that are worth arguing with one another about. Like, what does it mean to have access to education in our day under these circumstances? What does it mean to have access to healthcare? Like, these are all political goods. And you and I might come at these political goods from different perspectives. But the business of politics is that we debate, we, in the end, I suppose we try to reach a compromise and that. And so we can be a political community. We can belong with one another because we love these goods in common. We don't have to agree with each other. We just have to talk to each other about what we hold in common. So that to me seems like, this is like the political work of belonging. But political partisans, and like what you read out there about the partisans, I suppose I'm thinking more about those who want to play a zero-sum game, who really are sort of the us versus them. And this is like the extreme sort of ideological left, or like the extreme on the right as well. The sort of the in groups and the out groups. And like group identities, us versus them, on the left. On the right, you get other kinds of like groups that correlate with race or ethnicity, maybe even with nationalism, as opposed to patriotism. It's an us versus them mentality. And, then the response to this kind of extreme is, is every bit as, as extreme as the original extremity. So, and that seems to me not to be about belonging, but about division. So, yeah, I mean, the thing about the zero-sum game is that when you think in terms of groups, us versus them, and like this is maybe the deeper point. When you think in terms of group identities, you're thinking at the social level, or maybe at the demographic level, and you're not dealing with persons. The person gets eclipsed and gets replaced with this language of like an individual member of a social group. And so thinking that takes place on the demographic level, where you can talk about us versus them, it doesn't penetrate to the necessary level, which is the level of the person. If anything, where these partisans become even more extreme and start to manifest totalitarian tendencies, the work seems to go towards destroying personhood completely. I mean, obviously, you've got the concentration camps of, the right-wing National Socialists, and you've got like the communist socialists who had the gulags, and they're all aimed at destroying personality. They're all like to destroy the person. You could say conformity. This demand for conformity is the destruction of the personality as well. So the danger of thinking about belonging just at the social level is that you get into this this game of us versus them. It doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right. It's just it's a pattern that you fall into, and neither of the partisans are doing the proper, like they're not extending themselves to the proper, level of analysis, which
Mm-hmm.
is the level of the person, I would say, because
Mm-hmm.
it's the person who experiences belonging or alienation and so on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know for myself when I read this sentence, the first thing that popped into my mind was Heidegger, um,
Hmm.
which I think is
Right.
probably where a lot of people's minds would go.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and of course, like with Heidegger, I mean, depending on like what institution you're a part of or what sub guild you're a part of, he's almost like unquotable among some because of the Black Notebooks and so on.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, do you think that's part of the suspicion around the theme of belonging is that people think, like, for someone like Heidegger, for instance, that his like Nazism necessarily flows from kind of his thinking of home and of
Mhm.
place and these kinds of things?
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't mean that there isn't an insight that's worth an insight that he offers in his work that's worth thinking about. And so, like, I dedicate some of the first chapter in the book to Heidegger's contribution. Um, and I mean, he's on some pretty explosive territory. I mean, he has this notion of das Volk, right, the people, and this idea of essentialism, and you're really getting into this territory of us versus them, and it really does correlate with race and culture and so on. And it is dangerous. But what he's doing there is he's trying to think about the notion of Heimat or home. And what is home? And like he talks about home as something like an enclosure. It's an enclosure against the world. And you sort of think, well, okay, so what does that mean? And a lot of the things that he writes about bring you into this, into like, let's say, conceptual categories that you probably don't have a problem with. That, what do you do when you go home? You do sort of close your door against the world. You do kind of sit down with the people that you're closest to. You do refresh. You are restored. And there's a reason why, we've got doors and walls and windows and so forth. Okay, okay. I mean, it's a contribution. It's worth talking about. But again, it's like, is that all there is to say about home? Well, I hope not. And
Mhm.
in fact, in the book, I think I follow that discussion with talking about Levinas, and Levinas has Heidegger explicitly in mind, and he modifies the notion of home as an enclosure into something like a threshold. So here's a threshold over which we go out into the world and over which we can invite the world in. So again, it's like this metaxu, this in between, like the threshold is a kind of a liminal space. There's a transition that happens there, and it's a necessary transition. We need a home. We need a place. We do need to be restored. Um, there are people who are closest to us. There are people that we have special responsibilities to because of that closeness. We do need to protect them.
Mhm.
And yet, if all that belonging means is an enclosure, then you restrict your own personhood, I would say. You're certainly restricting your participation in the wider humanity, because belonging, and this follows from reading Levinas and others, is that belonging is like this series of, outwardly concentric circles. You can keep expanding your sphere of belonging from the center outwards, maybe right up to the whole kind of notion of humanity in general. Um, that yes, you belong to humanity, and you get right out to that level, um, and it's all part of home. But home still needs a center.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I it's easy, I suppose, for many of us to look at Heidegger's membership of the Nazi Party, which, like, he never repudiated.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be a real stain on him. But I sort of think about some of the nasty stuff I've said and done in my own life, and it's like, well, in principle, does that mean I've got nothing to offer?
Right.
Um, you know, well, I hope not. I hope I mean, this book is like an offering. I don't know what people are going to make of it. I mean, there's stuff in there that, hopefully is helpful, but it's sort of offered as something to build on, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to try and be somewhat charitable to somebody like Heidegger.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he's still worth reading because
Yeah.
he still provokes insights. You wrestle with Heidegger, and that's always worth doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So moving into kind of some of the more like some of the kind of more constructive portion of your book, you structure the book in these two parts, or kind of two titles for belonging, right? So belonging under kind of within kind of two categories that you call presence on the one hand and communion on the other. So in the context of the book and just in general on this theme of belonging, what do you mean when you use the words presence and communion as kind of categories of belonging?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, these are the two main divisions of the book. So, presence, presence is about persons. Persons are present to one another. So, this is the part of the book where I'm thinking about the human person, um, and the different ways in which we can be present to one another. And I've three chapters in there that, trying to open this up. The first one is what I'm calling a cosmological presence, that each of us is in the cosmos, each of us is of the cosmos. And, we can talk about what that means and what the cosmos is in a moment. But, you know, like there's a there's a chapter on cosmological presence. And in a sense, each of us is like a microcosmos for each other. Um, but we're also present to one another by way of our bodies and by way of our minds. Like, my students can be in the classroom, and, like, obviously I require them to be physically present. But, my shoe is also physically present in the classroom, so I need them to be present in other ways as well. So this is about their consciousness. And this, so we're bodily present and we're consciously present to one another. And then there's a chapter about how we're present to one another in love. So that's some of the work that I'm doing on persons, under that category of presence. And then communion is, well, what do we do with that? Okay, if presence is something like the condition of belonging, well, communion is all about community. And this can be, sort of our interpersonal relations with one another. It can be about families and friends. It can, expand outwards to, sort of the neighborhood or the city or the nation or humanity itself, right out to history. But communion is an exploration of what is at the center of our communities. What is it that binds us into a community? If a community is more than just an aggregate of people who happen to be in a place at the same time, well, then there's a communion. What is that? What does it mean to be in communion? So that's the second part of the book.
Hmm. Yeah, I know you mentioned it just briefly a minute ago, but I want to talk about it some more if that's okay. So one of the types of presence that you write about in the book, as you said, is cosmological presence,
Yeah,
what you call cosmological presence. So
yeah.
how would you mentioned kind of that it's us being kind of a microcosmos to one another. How would you kind of describe what you mean by this? What do presence and the cosmos have to do with one another in your mind?
Yeah. So this was one of the toughest chapters I had to write. So, like, the first thing to ask is, well, what do we mean by cosmos? It's not obvious to everyone what's meant by cosmos. And I suppose that what I mean by it is, if you spell cosmos with a K, then you get into the Greek world, which
Mm.
it means a sort of like an ordered totality of all things. It's sort of the matrix of reality that holds and gives rise to all things. Right? The cosmos is the bond and order. It's the whole of reality. Okay, it's not. It stands in opposition to chaos. It's again, it's the order. It's the order totality of all things. I mean, other terms that can be used that are approximately equivalent are being, or logos, or reality, but not universe. And so when I talk about cosmological presence, I'm not really talking about the universe, because the universe has to do with like the whole astrophysical biological emergence of material reality, and that is part of cosmos, but it's not all of cosmos. Because what's meant by cosmos, and I took this from the philosopher Eric Voegelin, um, he talks about the cosmos in terms of four basic fields of reality. There's what we call God, what we call man, thinking in terms of, so the individual person. There's the world. This is the astrophysical, biological emergence I just mentioned. And then there's society. So God and man, world and society. That each of the four seem to be what constitutes the cosmos. And we're part of that, right? To exist is to participate in the ordered totality of reality. That we're not just like little human units that are like free floating in space or something like that. Like, our existence is participation in what I'm calling the cosmos here. Um, we're partners, we're participants in this cosmos. And because we're in the cosmos and because we're real, then we're also of the cosmos, right?
Mm.
In other words, I'm real because I exist. Yeah, but reality is more than just me. So so when you start to think about participation in a cosmos, you start to think in terms of standing in a horizon, a meaningful horizon. And people get this because, like, if you're asking questions, somebody answers your question, that there can always be further questions. Like, you haven't exhausted all that's intelligible. You can keep asking questions. When you experience beauty, you could be totally transfixed by something beautiful, and yet it doesn't exhaust all the beauty is. Like, we exist in a horizon, and it's a horizon of the real. And what's real is us, right? We participate in it, we're of it, and yet it extends beyond us. We're a part within a whole. And so, like, the cosmos as this sort of bond and order of reality, it's like it includes divine mystery. Like, why does the cosmos exist at all? Like, it's not obvious.
Mhm.
So when we talk about cosmos, there's an element to that of divine mystery. There's an element to that of the astrophysical set of processes. There's an element to that of human intelligence and the limitations to human intelligence in persons and in like the social and cultural inheritance of our communities, right? It's all a totality. And the reason why I'm saying it's presence is because it's always there. We're always in a horizon. It's like an abiding presence. And I could say more about this. I mean, okay, I'll say one more thing, that the cosmos, like, in a very stark sense, the cosmos is the ordered totality of all that lasts and all that passes. right? And I know this because I'm confronted with my own mortality, all the time. I know that I'm not going to be around forever. And worse, those whom I love will not always be here with me.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm confronted with mortality all the time. I'm one small part of the cosmos. Um, but the thing about it is, like, although I will pass, I'm also, as a human being, asking questions about truth and goodness and beauty and belonging and the things that endure, the things that last. So, yeah, I'm mortal, but in a way, I'm kind of more than mortal. Like, this is one of the original Greek insights. This was Diotima's comment about love, that, yeah, you're mortal, but when you love, or when you're in pursuit of the things that last, that in that sense, you sort of transcend your mere mortality. You don't become divine,
Mm-hmm.
but in a sense, you're in this liminal in between space that we're calling metaxu. Okay. Um, I'm lifted toward what does not pass. So, and then it's a case of, well, if I'm in the cosmos and of the cosmos, and if the cosmos is what's sort of cosmologically always present, well, what then is death? Because, I mean, on the one hand, it's clear that, my mortal existence has come to an end, but does that mean that I'm entirely extinguished? Because I may be extinguished in bodily death, but I'm more than just a body. And so, in some ways, it's an open question,
Mm-hmm.
because the cosmos of lasting and passing, and ordered totality of lasting and passing, is what abides. It has an abiding presence. It abides in our lives and in our deaths.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is death? I mean, it's an open question. It's part of that mystery that also constitutes the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's really beautifully put. Okay, so we have the cosmos. What about our bodies? Like what role does our flesh play in kind of our sense of belonging?
yeah, our incarnation. Um, we, how important is it to touch or embrace or to kiss the people in your family?
Mm,
Like, that's sort of our way in here. What I do in the book, just to step back from that a little bit, is, like, I sort of set out this hermeneutic, like sort of like a framework. Like, we know what it feels like to belong, and we know what it feels like not to belong. But what exactly does it mean? And in the book, I try to work some of that out in the second chapter, and I set up uh, this language of, okay, well, so we exist, but it's not just like there's no. It's not that it's a neutral fact that we exist. Like, it's freighted with all kinds of meaning. It has direction. It has purpose. And so I set out two directions in our existence. And I just basically say there's existence from and there's existence toward. Now, this is all going to sound a little bit abstract, but we can concretize it pretty easily. To exist from means that you know you find yourself as constituted by, let's say, like, places and times, but also, like, your parents. You exist from your parents in you know organic ways, but also in the ways that they raised you, and also the places. There are people who come into your life, like your spouse and your children and so on, and they come to constitute who you take yourself to be. But you also exist towards them, right? You exist from them, but if you care about them, you exist towards them too. You're not indifferent to them. And to exist from and to exist toward is I think, the meaning of belonging. And so, to go back to your question about bodies, and you used the word flesh, the philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, like, he uses this term flesh, and he's working through the significance of the body in terms of what we exist from and what we exist towards, which for me is about belonging. He uses the phrase, the flesh of the world. And the flesh of the world is like this physicality that's primordially meaningful to us. And I think that's approximately equivalent to cosmological presence in some ways. You know, we have physicality in our own being. Like, I have my body, you have your body. And the world has this kind of bodiliness. And our lives are sort of in between our own physicality and the physicality of the world. His term is l'entre-deux, or intercorporeity. Again, it's a way of getting at Diotima's term metaxou. We exist in between the flesh of the world. Like, we exist from it because we are of that physical world, but we exist toward it too in what he calls our perceptions. Like, we find that bodiliness is primary, is primordial, and he calls that like first order expression. Now, what we do with that, right? What you experience the world. Okay, well, so what sense do you make of it? Like, what are you going to do with that? Well, this can eventually become second order expression, where we sort of categorize and make deliberations and so on. We're abstracting from the primary experience of the world, that kind of abiding presence of physicality, the flesh of the world that we know through our own flesh. But in second order expression, you know, quite often we risk losing that meaningful spontaneity of the first order. You know, and then there's Levinas. I'll just be brief with this, but you know, like in the book, I talk about the caress. Levinas thinks through the meaning of the caress when we touch the flesh of the beloved. Like, what exactly is going on? Like, what is the meaning of that? And he uses this term that it's interesting. It's like, it's when you touch the flesh of the one that you love, it's more like a sort of a foraging, right? And I think about, well, what forages? I think of hedgehogs kind of snuffling in the undergrowth, right? But it's kind of a searching. What are you searching for? And for Levinas, the caress is like the bodily expression of our searching for transcendence. That the beloved is this occasion of transcendence in your midst. Like, in between lover and beloved, there's this, like, he uses this beautiful term, the interpersonal curvature of space. Like, between me and my beloved, it's not measured in like inches or centimeters or something. It's a space that's full of a kind of a transcendence. And you know, the one that you love comes to you as though from on high. And so you respond to her. It's like you're foraging and searching for transcendence. So that the caress, like the touching of the flesh of the lover with your own flesh, is a kind of a hunger. And if it's love, not lust, if it's love, then it's a hunger that's paradoxically fed by its own hunger. Like, you just become more hungry. You become more in love. Lust it demands its satisfaction. So the lover, you know, in all of this bodiliness and all this fleshiness, has to be careful because, as Levinas says, he's on holy ground. He needs to be careful because voluptuosity, again, another one of Levinas' terms, voluptuosity, well, I suppose it can drive you crazy. It can make you careless. So anyway, okay, well, that's kind of a long answer to, well,
No, that was great. No, I was loving that.
Everything to do with it. Yeah.
No, I was really enjoying that. This is maybe a turn from more intimate terrain that we've been talking about towards maybe more of a societal terrain. but one of the terms that comes up a lot in your book and is a really important feature of your book is this word communitas. So
Yeah.
what do you mean when you use that term? And then I know it's got a long and complicated history, but so this is a hard question maybe to answer, but I wonder if you might say something about kind of the rough contours of the history that this term has had.
Yeah. Okay. Well, rough contours is what you're going to get.
Sounds good.
So, yeah, I mean, I use the term communitas. You might say, well, why don't you just talk about community? That's what communitas means. What are you doing? You know, is this kind of academic jargon? Um, well, it is, but there's a reason why I wanted to use communitas. Because the term community has become this ubiquitous term, and it's quite often used for um, it's sometimes used in what I think are not philosophically appropriate ways. So, okay, so here's what I have in the background. There's an English thinker by the name of Michael Oakeshott, and he made a distinction between civil associations and enterprise associations. So, what's an enterprise association? Well, any enterprise has some sort of a goal towards which it's striving. It wants to achieve something. There's a good that it's reaching for. It wants to maybe establish or realize some kind of a good. And you might think, okay, so enterprise associations, are they communities? Well, what would those sorts of enterprise communities be? Well, you might think about workplace communities or online social media communities or communities that build up around some kind of a product like Tesla. Like, are there Tesla communities? Are there, like, Apple iPhone communities? There are activist communities. These are all in their own way sort of like enterprises. They're there's a kind of an external good that they congregate around. And, I'm not sure what you would call that. Maybe community is okay, but what I'm trying to get at is not so much this external good. I'm trying to talk about more what Oakeshott means by civil association. That we are already that good to the extent that we're in community. In other words, there's a communion that already holds us and sustains us, and we find ourselves in community because of it. And so, like at the micro level, like there's friendship and there's family. There are local communities, regional, national communities. There's faith communities. In other words, like to use the term communitas, what I'm really trying to point towards there is that there is already a good, not one necessarily to be striven for, but it's one that's already realized in some ways, and that's the communion that our community manifests. Like we already live by that communion. So, in terms of how that sort of came around, like there are a few things I suppose you could say here. It's a Latin term, communitas, and one of the early uses of communitas is in relation to the civitas, like in the Roman world. And what's meant by civitas is that here's a political community. It doesn't stand by itself as like an aggregate of people in a place at a time. Like the civitas is expressive of the I suppose the inherent unity that makes the parts into a whole. Like there's something that holds the parts together and constitutes them as a whole. That's what the civitas is. There's nothing arbitrary about it, and so it's a type of communitas. And I talk about some of the early church fathers as well who use the term. There's Ambrose when he's, I suppose, working through Christology, and he talks about the second person of the Trinity. He talks about the Word, that the Word is in eternal communitas with the Father, because the Word too is eternal. Okay, so Father and Son are co-eternal. But if the Son, if the Word were to have begun at some point in time, like if the second person of the Trinity were not co-eternal, then let's say the Word began at like the birth of Jesus, then the Word would have communitas only with humans. That it, it the eternal, the eternality of the second person of the Trinity establishes, the communitas, like the Trinity as a communitas. And then Augustine himself goes on to talk about this, that the Holy Spirit is the communion of Father and Son. And so the Trinity is a communitas, right? The Father is what? Holy. What else is the Father? Spirit. Well, who's the Son? Well, the Son is holy and the Son is Spirit. So what's common with Father and Son is holiness and the Spirit. And so their communion is Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
So the Trinity then is a communitas because there's already a communion. And this is the third person of the Trinity, okay, who is the communion. Okay, so the communitas of the Trinity manifests the communion of three in one. I could say a few more things. If you like, but like it does have this sort of history. Like Saint Benedict, when he's developing his rule, he talks about ways in which we can excommunicate ourselves. Why? Because we fall out of communion with one another. We end up being excommunicated because, in a sense, we've already communicated ourselves. We're the ones who fell out of communion, maybe because of something that we said or did or thought. So communitas is manifest of the presence of a communion that's already there. It's already the good. It's not something to be achieved like the sort of enterprise associations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really just, I use that term really just to make that clarification.
Yeah. No, thank you. What about in kind of the political realm? Like, could we think about something like a political communitas? And if so, what would such a thing, or what might such a thing kind of look like?
Yeah. Well, I suppose in different ways I've mentioned it already, but like the pattern is basically this. And I took it mostly from reading The City of God,
Hmm.
from Augustine, that for people to find themselves not as an aggregate, but as a people, like as a communitas, is to find that we love things in common. In other words, that there are political goods, that there are goods that lie at the very center of our community. And we find that we are a community because even if we don't particularly like one another, because maybe we're always arguing with one another, nonetheless, we love these goods in common. And so political community, it's a very different kind of community, or communitas. It's a different kind of communion because I don't necessarily have to agree or even like my compatriots, but I do know that they are my compatriots because they love what I love. They might have a different spin on these political goods. They might have a different way of approaching these political goods. The political goods mean something different, and I profoundly disagree with what they mean to some of these people. But still, we share these goods in common, and so my compatriot is somebody that's worth talking to, is worth sitting down with and having robust conversations with, is somebody who's worth spending time with because what we do together is aimed towards these goods that we love in common. And, you know, the American case, I think, is very interesting. So I'm coming at this from the outside. I'm on the inside now. Okay, so I'm here,
Hmm.
and I have American citizenship, and I'm very thankful. But still, I've come from somewhere else, and I sort of think about, first of all, let's say Ireland as a political community, and I think about America as a political community. And, in some ways, whatever constitutes the Irish as a political community, and like we're still fighting about it in some ways, but really in deeper ways, we've already found ourselves as a people. Like it's somewhere back in the mists of time. Um, and the American case is is still relatively recently. Like
Mm-hmm.
Americans are still working out the conditions of the founding. What does it mean to have an American communitas? Because there are goods that we love in common, so there really is such a thing as a political communion that's a distinctly American political communion. I mean, you can use the term political order. So the American political order. You know, I'll, this is slightly related. This is a comment that I made one time at a conference, and of course, everybody sort of, thought I was just joking, but it's a serious enough point. In Ireland, we have basically three settings to our lives. One is our home. One is our workplace, and then there's the pub, right? And what happens in the pub? You go and you sit down with people that you're familiar with. Maybe you go with some friends, but you're surrounded by people that you might know and you might not know. But these are usually local people. And sometimes conversations start and you kind of talk out the things that you experience together. You get to know people and you expand your sphere of belonging and you find that you have things in common with people. And that's the importance, like the political importance of the third setting. And so in America, where's that third setting? We have home, we have work, and it's not obvious where that third setting is. And this was something that Jefferson was very concerned about, why he was really, he was an advocate of the town halls. He wanted people to come together. He wanted people to talk about the sorts of goods that they held in common that made them a people. Because if you don't do that, you fall out of communion with one another. And and the political communitas is jeopardized because those political goods are eclipsed. So it's worth thinking about, you know, like the political communitas, the political realm. What are the political goods and how much do we care about them? And what does it mean to be in political communion with one another? So
Mm-hmm.
anyway,
Mm-hmm.
I make my suggestions and I offer a few ideas in the book, and it's the basis for further conversations, I think.
Yeah, sure, sure. So, I want to wrap up our conversation today by looking at this, kind of the way you conclude the book, which is with this really lovely chapter on sacramentality, and especially the parts in there that are more specifically kind of about the Eucharist. So how might we kind of think of the Eucharist as a figure or a model of belonging?
Yeah, yeah. Um, you know, that that chapter on sacramentality, like I'm not really making any religious claims in here, but the reason I wrote it was because it seems to me that every communion needs its consummation. It needs its completion. It needs its perfection. Every communion reaches out for its consummation. And for me, the Eucharist is an exemplar. And so it's worth thinking about the Eucharist as exemplar. Um, and to think about the Eucharist, I think you have to think about the meaning of two terms. And one of them is uh, the term sacrament. Okay, so the chapter is about sacramentality. And like a sacrament is something of a theophany, like it's a mode of appearance of the sacred. I mean, you can have prophecy, you can have mystical experience, but you can also have sacramentality. And the sacrament is a manifestation of the sacred and the extraordinary in the midst of the ordinary, like in the ordinariness of things. It's like a shining forth of the sacred. and I think we know this. When you think about belonging, I think we know this. Like, there's nothing more ordinary than like your own family and your friends. It's just part of your ordinary life. But in a way, there's nothing more extraordinary than having a family and having friends. Um, it's like belonging is your point of access to to the sacred in some
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you something to hold on to, and so that even the most secular people can have this experience of sacramentality. They're not going to use the term, and people can have problems with the term sacramentality or sacrament, but it's a manifestation of the extraordinary. To belong is to have a home. It's to have a center in like the total scope of reality. It's like a sacred center for us. Like we've talked about this sort of enclosure, but also threshold, a sort of an in-between liminal space that you pass over to go into the home, and sort of you pass over the threshold to go out into the world. And home is where you refresh and fortify yourself. Why? Well, hopefully to go out and to love and to serve the world. And so the home has this quality of sacramentality to it, right? It's ordinary, but there's also something extraordinary there as well. It's the refreshment of body and soul. So so this is something to do with the sacrament, okay? Like the sacramentality. I'm obviously not in a theological mode here. I'm a philosopher. And so the Eucharist. So what do we mean by the Eucharist? Well, in the book, I'm relying on various thinkers, but especially Aquinas, who sort of lays it out that the Eucharist, what's meant by that is threefold. That here's a self-sacrifice of Christ that took place in time, right? It's a sacrifice that happened, but it's also a sort of a binding of the people in the representation of that sacrifice. And so we can be in communion with one another. So we could talk about the Eucharist not just as sacrifice, but as communion. But what else is it? So thirdly, it's efficacious. It's a flow of grace, like eucharistia in Greek. It's like good grace or good favor. It's this flow of grace. So it's like a flow of the transcendent, divine, the eternal, sacred life of God. We are not just in communion with one another, but we're in communion with God. And so the Eucharist is all of these things. It's this efficacious sign of the communion of the whole cosmos with its transcendent divine ground. In a way, like I use the sacrament of the Eucharist as a sort of a ground zero. It's like an axis mundi that Mircea Eliade talks about. It
Mm-hmm.
joins together all the planes of reality together. It's like the ordered totality, the bond and order of all things. And so the Eucharist kind of brings you, it presents sort of a model of the ordered totality of all things. And for me, it's also the sacrament of the metaxu, the in between that I've been talking about. That belonging seems to be it's of the in between. Like here's the sacramental presence of Christ. Well, who's Christ? Christ is wholly human and wholly divine, right? Sort of in between both. That our communion with God is a sort of, I'm sort of struggling for the right words to say here, but it's our communion with God in the Eucharist answers a question of the human predicament and the suffering that can come along with that. Like when we think about Job, who wanted to know why he had to suffer, he asked a question that was not answerable. But what he did get was God's presence. He did have a communion with God. And it answered the question of his alienation, his forsakenness. And it did address the reality of his suffering, though it wasn't an intellectual response to the question of his suffering. So for the Eucharist, this communion with God is like it's a communion with God in the fullness of divine glory, but it's also a communion with Christ who's on the cross, who's forsaken. So this in-betweenness is like the glory of the resurrection and the forsakenness of the crucifixion.
Mm.
And in that moment, Christ says, consummatum est, it is consummated. What is consummated? What is completed? What has happened? And in my poor non-theological ways of thinking as a mere philosopher, I can only conclude that what's consummated is the communion of humanity, a humanity of persons with God. Again, each communion must have its consummation. You know this because, friends need to be in contact with one another. They need to talk. They need to meet. You can meet up with people that you haven't seen in a long time, and you just pick right up because you already have this wealth in common, and you just pick it up, and they mean something to you. Like there's a sort of a capital that you've already established, and so that's a communion that needs consummation. It's the coming together of friends. Obviously, like, and I talk about matrimony in the book as well. I mean, there's a very particular, a very unique, and very special and life-giving consummation of the matrimonial communion. Like, no matter what kind of communion we're talking about, they all need their consummation. And as far as I can tell, the Eucharist is like like this wonderful model, this wonderful exemplar of this consummation,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because it brings you right into this in-betweenness of belonging. So for me, the Eucharist is the sacrament of the in-between.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. James, thank you so much for this lovely conversation today. I've really enjoyed learning from
Thank you
you.
for your questions.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed learning from you in our chat and also from reading your book. I do like to give guests a chance at the end of every episode just to share what's kind of next for them. So, do you have anything you're working on? Anything you might like to share about here?
Well, I suppose there are two things. I have a manuscript that I'm just finishing uh, on grief. Actually,
Mm,
it's more about where grief becomes lamentation. I'm not sure what to call the book yet. Maybe something like the sacramentality of grief, but sacramentality is a big word. It's
mm,
maybe not good for a title, but so I'm working on that. It's really about how we belong to one another and what grief at the loss of somebody that we love can tell us about how we belong to one another, how we belong
mm,
within the mystery of the cosmos, our fragility, our more than mere mortality. So
mm,
there's that.
mhm,
And I'm also putting together a book proposal for a follow-up for the Philosophy of Belonging book. I think I'm going to call it The Mythos of Belonging. And I find that in thinking about belonging, I'm thinking more and more about symbolism. And so anyway, that's to come.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
so I'm looking forward to sitting down over the next year or two and trying to get that book pulled together.
Yeah, no, that those both sound like lovely projects. Perhaps in the future we can have more conversations as those come out. Um, James, yeah, thank you once again for taking the time today. I so appreciate what you did with this book and for taking some time on a Saturday to chat with me
Yeah,
about it.
yeah. Zach, thanks very much for reading the book, and you were very generous in reading the book so closely, and I appreciate the intelligent questions, and it's a wonderful thing for an author to be able to talk to somebody who's paid such close attention to the book.
Mm.
So
Mhm,
thank you.
mhm. Yeah, of course, of course.